It's the time in our service where we collect an offering. To those attending MCC Boston through our YouTube page, you too can participate by going to our website at mccboston.org and clicking on the donate button there for that purpose. Thank you for being a part of our church family. Members and friends of MCC Boston, from the time of our denomination's founding, UFMCC understood itself as ecumenical, recognizing that MCCers would come from many different Christian backgrounds and faiths, or no faith at all. It was at the 1974 General Conference held in San Francisco, where Reverend Nancy Wilson, representing the newly formed Worcester Group, made the motion that MCC should seek to join the National Council of Churches in the U.S. and the World Council of Churches worldwide. It's worth mentioning that on Friday night of that conference, at 3 minutes to 8, Reverend Troy Perry received the news and informed the conference that a bomb was to detonate at 8 o'clock in the worship hall. While the police stood outside waiting, the 700 people attending remained in their seats and went on with the worship service, knowing there was not enough time for everyone to evacuate and that God would be their protector. The many prayers spoken in those 3 minutes that night were answered as the bomb never materialized, affording MCC the opportunity to witness to the world the level of our unity and the depth of our faith. It was during the conference meeting when Reverend Nancy's motion was made and was passed without debate because most people thought that it would be impossible. For folks who don't know, the World Council of Churches was formed in 1948, and since that time has held assemblies once every 7 or 8 years. The event draws 5,000 people, representing more than 340 denominations and regional councils, such as the National Council of Churches in the U.S. Initially, MCC would show up and hold protest signs that read, "Stonewall rises again," and "Lesbian, gay, bisexual, we are already in the church. Let us be open and free." It took until 1991 at the Council in Australia for MCC to be granted observer status to the World Council of Churches. MCC sent a delegation of 5 people, including Reverend Nancy Wilson, our AIDS Field Director, Reverend Steve Peters, and Reverend Greg Smith, the pastor of MCC Sydney. Both Greg and Steve participated on a panel on HIV/AIDS, with Greg being the first person with HIV/AIDS and the first MCCer to speak before the whole assembly. It was actually harder for MCC to gain access to the U.S. National Council of Churches, but by 1992 we'd grown impatient, and when the council once again denied observer status, Reverend Nancy Wilson seized the podium, yelling into the microphone, "It's easier to get into heaven than the NCC." During that same assembly, MCC arranged for a National Council of Churches member to advocate for LGBTQ rights. Reverend John Taktatos spoke passionately to the Orthodox leaders, who were the main opponents blocking MCC's membership. Unfortunately, John died of complications from AIDS before being able to see our participation status officially granted. Today, MCC holds observer status with the World Council of Churches and has participation status with the National Council of Churches, including full membership in a few states. It was our persistence and the telling of our queer stories that enabled our participation by helping the greater church see we're more alike than we are different. That's why it's so important for MCC to continue, to be here to tell our stories, to build bridges, to work for greater inclusion of queer folk in church and society. So this week, give thanks for UFMCC, for our historic work toward full inclusion, and for our work yet to be accomplished.
Tonight's reading is from Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 28. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered King Nebuchadnezzar, "Your threat means nothing to us. If you throw us in the fire, the God we serve can rescue us from your roaring furnace and anything else you might cook up, O king. But even if he doesn't, it wouldn't make a bit of difference, O king. We still wouldn't serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up." Nebuchadnezzar, his face purple with anger, cut off Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace fired up 7 times hotter than usual. He ordered some strong men from the army to tie them up, hands and feet, and throw them into the roaring furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, bound hand and foot, fully dressed from head to toe, were pitched into the roaring fire. Because the king was in such a hurry, and the furnace was so hot, flames from the furnace killed the men who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to it, while the fire raged around Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Suddenly, King Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm and said, "Didn't we throw 3 men bound head and foot into the fire?" "That's right, O king," they said. "But look," he said, "I see 4 men walking around freely in the fire, completely unharmed. And the 4th man looks like one of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar went to the door of the roaring furnace and called in, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the high God, come out here." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked out of the fire. All the important people, the government leaders, and king's counselors gathered around to examine them and discovered the fire hadn't so much as touched the 3 men. Not a hair singed, not a scorch mark on their clothes, not even the smell of fire on them. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent angels and rescued these servants who trusted in their God. They ignored the king's orders and laid their bodies on the line rather than serve or worship any god but their own."
Happy third Sunday of Lent and Women's History Month. It is crazy to think that it is already March, and it is truly exciting to see a little bit more sun in the mornings and evenings and to see temperatures getting slightly warmer. So last week, I talked a little bit about my personal experiences with Lent and how I wanted to see it as a time of self-transformation. Last week, we explored a bit about the story of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness and the Israelites, God's chosen people, being in the wilderness for 40 years. So taking this idea of the wilderness, we explored a bit of environmental philosophy to understand the wilderness symbolizes fear and hardship, but most importantly, transformation of self. We saw transformation happening after Jesus' time in the wilderness as he began his public ministry and found his disciples, and through the Israelites as after 40 years, they finally reached their final destination into the Promised Land. So after preaching that sermon last week, I felt a sense of freshness to have a different perspective on my day-to-day action for the coming week. I thought I would take on this week with a more positive attitude, but of course, this past week, there was a lot of things that have gone wrong for me, and I felt super frustrated at myself, the people around me, and my faith, because sometimes it's just hard to experience bad things one after another. One of the things that I've been dealing with is that I am planning on moving, and as many of us know, that is a very stressful thing here in Boston. So one of the things that I wanted to explore this week, as I promised us last week that I was going to do a 2-part series, is when we are in the wilderness, how can we sustain ourselves to make it to the end where we finally reach the point of transformation? This topic is very important to me because, as I shared at the end of my sermon last week, there are times when people don't make it out of their wildernesses. People choose to give up on themselves. And this theme is really important to me because at Divinity School, I have chosen to focus my studies on how to do ministry for LGBTQ plus youth, specifically youth who struggle with mental health and suicidal ideations. Recently, in a study conducted by the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, on June 2020, the CDC reported an exponential growth in people of all age groups and cultural backgrounds experiencing mental health issues, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation during COVID-19. More specifically, within the age group of 18 to 24, 18 the youngest age group that the CDC surveyed, researchers found that 49.1% of this age group struggled with anxiety disorder, 52.3% struggled with depressive disorders, 24.7% indicated an increase of substance use to cope with pandemic-related stress. And what I found really shocking is that 25.5% of 18 to 24-year-olds seriously considered suicide in the past 30 days. In this study, the 18 to 24 age group reported the highest percentage of suicide ideation out of any other age group, and we see this trend rising. Now, if you look at the rates of LGBTQ plus youth, research has found that these youth are 3 times more likely to consider suicide than their heterosexual counterpart. And we're talking about youth as young as 10 years old. Young children who are constantly bullied for who they are, who are stuck in their wildernesses, don't make it out alive, and they don't get to experience their point of transformation. So this week, I wanted to talk about how we push through the wilderness and how in times of adversity, we have faith to kind of live through the harshness in order to get to a position of transformation. And the story that I thought would help us is the story that we read today in the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel begins with King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon raiding Jerusalem, the capital of the Promised Land, and taking captive some of the people. Last week, we talked about the Israelites finally getting into the Promised Land, and now we're seeing the beginnings of the exile period where Jerusalem begins to crumble. In the specific passage that we read today, we see that the story begins with King Nebuchadnezzar creating a statue of himself made of gold, and every time people heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and other music, they had to immediately fall down to worship this image of gold. And whoever did it would immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So here comes the part of the story where we see our protagonist, Daniel's 3 friends, struggling through their wilderness. King Nebuchadnezzar finds that there are some Jews that are not following the king's order and refusing to worship the statue. These people include the 3 friends, names that I cannot pronounce. Furious, the king orders that the 3 friends be thrown into the fire, and we know that the fire is extremely hot, not only because the king orders it to be lit 7 times hotter, but the people who were throwing the men into the fire died immediately from the heat. Most biblical commentators write that the first half of the book of Daniel, the stories that we are all familiar with, are about God's people refusing to conform to pagan culture. This happens in chapter 1 as Daniel and his 3 friends refuse to eat the food and wine presented by the king and instead only eats vegetables and water. Daniel and his friends get blessed by God and are healthy, smart, and get promoted. This is happening in our story today, chapter 3, as the 3 friends refuse to bow down to the golden statue of the king and are thrown into a burning furnace and survive. And this happens again to Daniel, who prays when it is illegal to pray and is thrown into the lion's den. But while yes, these stories show the refusal to pagan culture, I'm kind of hesitant to agree that this is the meaning of the text, because many of the interpreters have used this to kind of preach anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, which of course is not something that we believe in. So instead, I think that these stories, especially the story that we read today, show the importance of faith and what to do when faced with hard times. Faith is shown from the three friends as they are presented to the king and is asked why they didn't bow and worship. They said, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and God will deliver us from your majesty's hand." So when doing a quick Google search on what faith is, you will find that definitions include trust, I have faith in you, and hope, I have faith that things will get better. But one of my favorite definitions of faith is by theologian Paul Tillich in Dynamics of Faith, where Tillich defines faith to be the ultimate concern. The dynamics of faith are the dynamics of man's ultimate concern. The ultimate concern demands complete surrender of the person who faithfully accepts the concern, therefore it is ultimate. What I find striking about Tillich's definition of faith as the ultimate concern is that faith is the most centered act of the human mind. It engulfs all of our being, and it is what makes us human. Tillich writes that faith is part of our personality. Faith is one that compels us, inspires us, it demands complete acceptance of the person. The source of this faith is the concern about the unconditional. The ultimate concern is concern about what is experienced as ultimate. So what does this all mean? What I find so fascinating about this definition of faith as an ultimate concern is that it kind of pinpoints faith as this human experience. Tillich writes that humans can only understand what their faith is by contemplating and reflecting on what is most important to us. And these important values, beliefs, or people only come from our lived experiences in our everyday lives. We have the agency to decide what is our ultimate concern, our faith, and what is most important in our lives. For the three friends in our Bible passage, we see that their faith, or ultimate concern, was on their heritage and the God that they served. So even when they were challenged, thrown into crazy hot fire, they had no fear because they knew that they took a leap of faith and was staying true to their ultimate concern, which was God. They refused to worship the king because they already had a king that they served. They probably didn't know if they were going to live or die, but what is important is that they were willing to do anything to stay true to their faith. I think faith is this really interesting, complicated, and mysterious phenomenon. We see that faith ultimately manifesting during the climax of our text when King Nebuchadnezzar ultimately sees not 3, but 4 men walking around in the fire, unharmed and unburnt. The 4th man was described to look like a son of the gods. While there are many interpretations of whether this was Jesus or the angel Gabriel, what I am interested in is seeing faith manifesting into a physical representation and essentially protecting and walking alongside the 3 friends who had faith in this being. I reflected heavily on what it means to help people who are in the wilderness, specifically LGBTQ youth who struggle with reaching to the end of the wilderness, to the point of transformation. And I think that one of the things that have really struck out to me is this idea of faith. As queer people, we know that the wilderness experience is going to be a daily part of life. We know that we are going to struggle in the hands of our government with their anti-LGBTQ laws, or people around us who spew out homophobic rhetoric because we will always be seen as different than our heterosexual counterpart. But I think that we need to foster the idea of faith, or help each of us understand, explore, and accept the ultimate concerns or things that are worth living for to those in the wilderness. We need to help understand that when we are in the darkest of times, the hottest of fires, or the loneliness of wilderness, we have faith that will protect us and guide us into the promised land of transformation. So for this Lent season, I hope that we can truly experience our faith, or whatever we define as our ultimate concerns, manifesting in our everyday lives as we struggle through the wilderness. Thank you.